Good morning, and welcome to Future Trends, where we examine the latest stories reshaping tomorrow's international dynamics. This week, we're covering the potential widespread geopolitical and economic impacts of major conflict escalations in the Middle East. This week's headlines: Israel-Iran conflict leaves global economy precarious. Denmark approves US military bases. Supply chains the new battleground in trade war. Brazil makes social media companies liable for user content. And an AI model identifies thoughts from brainwaves. Starting with politics, Russia to build military footprint in Africa. Despite sanctions imposed by Western nations, Moscow is using cargo ships to send tanks, armored vehicles, artillery and other high-value equipment to West Africa, even as Russia Corps withdraws troops from Mali. The two-year-old Africa Corps, which has links to a covert branch of Russia's army, is ascendant at a time when US and European troops have been withdrawing from the region, forced out by sub-Saharan nations turning to Russia for security. Mali grants junta leader 5 more years in power. Earlier in May, General Goita signed a decree dissolving political parties, a decision made against a backdrop of burgeoning opposition. It coincided with a surge in kidnappings of pro-democracy activists in the capital, Bamako, and just days after a demonstration by several hundred activists. The junta had promised a return to civilian rule by March 2024, but later postponed elections. Netanyahu survives vote to dissolve parliament. While the Israeli Prime Minister narrowly survived a motion to dissolve Israel's parliament, the vote exposed deep fractures within his governing coalition, raising fresh questions about the stability of his leadership. EU and UK strike political agreement on Gibraltar. The UK and Spain have been trying to reach a deal for years to ensure that people and goods could cross freely over the British overseas territory's land border with Spain. The EU and the UK struck a political agreement to ensure the continued circulation of people and goods between Spain and Gibraltar without any physical barriers. Uganda reintroduces military trials for civilians. The amendment signed by President Museveni will allow, once again, civilians to be tried in a military court under certain circumstances. A previous law permitting such trials was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and activists said the law was used to persecute government critics. Turning to conflict news, the Israel-Iran conflict leaves the global economy precariously placed. Either of two scenarios would be disastrous for the global economy. If Iran blocks the Straits of Hormuz, through which passes a quarter of the world's seaborne oil and a third of the gas, or if Israel takes out Iran's oil production facilities on Karg Island. The oil price surged more than 7% after news of Israel's initial attack. Israel is now at war on 7 fronts. One of the most frequently uttered phrases by Netanyahu and senior officials in his government and military ranks is that Israel is at war on 7 fronts. The Prime Minister sees threats in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, the West Bank, and believes much of it is fueled from front number 7, Iran. India's new war strategy against Pakistan sees it rewriting the rules of engagement. In response to high-casualty terrorist attacks, most recently the 2025 Pahalgam attack that triggered Operation Sindoor, New Delhi has adopted calibrated military retaliation designed to operate below the nuclear threshold. More than 122 million people have been forcibly displaced worldwide. The UN Refugee Agency says the number of people forcibly displaced by violence and persecution has risen by 2 million from last year and a near doubling over the last decade. UNHCR said Sudan has become home to the world's largest displacement crisis, with more than 14 million people displaced by the conflict, surpassing Syria at 13.5 million. More than 122 million people forcibly displaced worldwide. The UN Refugee Agency says the number of people forcibly displaced by violence and persecution has risen by 2 million from last year and a near doubling over the last decade. UNHCR said Sudan has become home to the world's largest displacement crisis, with more than 14 million people displaced by the conflict, surpassing Syria at 13.5 million. Moving to economics, the World Bank has cut global growth forecasts. Global growth in 2025 will be the weakest outside of a recession since 2008 and the global financial crisis. The bank lowered its forecasts for nearly 70% of all economies, including the US and Europe. By 2027, global gross domestic product growth was expected to average just 2.5%, the slowest pace of any decade since the 1960s. It also forecasts that the US-driven global trade war will depress growth in almost two-thirds of developing economies this year, as the globalization that drove an economic miracle in many countries reverses. US will get rare earths from China under New Deal. US President Trump says America will get rare earth minerals and magnets from China under a new trade deal with Beijing, which will also see tariffs on Chinese goods move to 55%. China, the world's biggest producer of rare earths, has signaled it may ease export restrictions it placed on the elements in April, troubling automakers around the world who rely on them. Botswana reduces diamond production amid weak demand. Global demand for diamonds is falling, and lab-grown diamonds are becoming a cheaper alternative. Diamonds make up 80% of Botswana's export revenue, and IIS 2025 diamond output will be 16% lower than last year. Supply chains are the new battleground in global trade war. A key lesson from the latest moves in the US-China trade war is that the era of weaponized supply chains has arrived. Oil in the new age of volatility. High prices will undermine US plans to drive inflation lower and make it harder for its Federal Reserve to cut rates. In development news, critical minerals are giving China an edge in trade negotiations. China's dominance over critical minerals in global supply chains was a powerful bargaining chip in trade talks between Beijing and Washington that concluded with both sides saying they have a framework to pursue a deal. Denmark approves US military bases. The move to allow US military bases on Danish soil comes as US President Trump seeks to take control of the kingdom's semi-autonomous territory of Greenland. Brazil's Supreme Court makes social media companies liable for user content. The ruling to make social media companies liable for illegal postings by their users was a landmark case for Latin America, with implications for US relations. Companies like Meta, X, and Microsoft to be sued and pay fines for content published by their users. UK, Germany, and Canada cut foreign aid. Western countries have reduced foreign aid budgets this year, with more coming in 2026. The US, UK, Germany, and Canada cut the most, led by the US with a projected 56% reduction compared to 2 years ago. 97% of India iPhone exports sent to US amid tariffs. Nearly all the iPhones exported by Foxconn from India went to the US between March and May, far above the 2024 average of 50% and a sign of Apple's efforts to bypass high US tariffs imposed on China. The numbers show Apple has realigned its India exports to almost exclusively serve the US market, when previously the devices were more widely distributed to countries including the Netherlands, Czech Republic, and Britain. Finally, our social news. EU court ruling is backing bans on bottom trawling. The ban on deep-sea fishing in parts of the Atlantic, rich with marine life, means these areas will remain restricted to help preserve vulnerable species and ecosystems. The decision comes after the same court ruled last month in a German case that marine protected areas must be protected from bottom trawling. Brazil to auction oil exploration rights months before hosting COP30. Sale covering 145,000 square kilometers set to go ahead, despite opposition from indigenous and environmental groups. Emperor penguin populations shrink by almost a quarter. Global warming is melting their icy habitat in Antarctica, with the estimated population of 16 penguin colonies declining by 22%, Number of children involved in child labor improves. Nearly 138 million children were engaged in child labor in 2024, including around 54 million in hazardous work likely to jeopardize their health, safety, or development. The latest UNICEF data show a total reduction of over 20 million children since 2020, reversing a sharp rise between 2016 and 2020. AI model to identify thoughts from brainwaves. The technology uses a skull cap and deep learning to translate the brain signals from EEG into specific words. Deep learning is a form of AI that uses artificial neural networks to mimic how the human brain works to learn from data, in this case, lots of EEG data. Sound very all? That's your Future Trends update for this week. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time with more stories reshaping our world.